Good evening and thank you for coming. I'm very excited to be here again for our 8th installment of User Manual for Humans. And for those of you who have missed the other 7, please feel free to go back and review those on YouTube and my website. Today we will speak about DNA and heredity, because that's a topic, it's a very important topic, and there are tremendous misconceptions on it, so we'll try to straighten out some of that. First of all, I won't talk about it now, but we'll mention real quickly what we're going to cover. What is DNA? We want to have a clear understanding of what it is. We want to see what does DNA do, and more importantly, what does DNA not do? Because throughout history we have ascribed lots of properties to DNA that it doesn't have, and we will cover those. So on slide 2 here, these are some of the commonly accepted viewpoints and ideas about DNA. And if you read magazines and you hear the little news briefs they throw at you, or if you open up a textbook on medical physiology, even today, in 2011, they still say that DNA controls biology. And the key word there we will talk about is control. I underline that. Does DNA really control biology? They also believe that DNA is the control center of the cell. They believe that DNA is the brain of the cell. We hear in the news that virtually every day that DNA causes diseases, and we hear that they found this new gene that links DNA to breast cancer, to liver disease, to obesity. And one of my favorites that I heard we'll get back to is they found a hangover gene. So now you have an excuse, right? We'll come back and put that in perspective. And they say that because of all this, DNA makes diseases run in families. So what's important to understand here is that what they're talking about is associations, that they have observed associations, and that this does not imply any sort of control or cause. So associations and assumptions is what this is based on. There's never been a proposed mechanism or cause for how DNA would do any of this. They just got so excited that they assumed it. And we will talk about this in detail. I'll have a few quotes, and here's one of my favorites by Schopenhauer. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as self-evident. And of course, the classic example is that the earth is flat. Okay? Everybody knew that. How could you be so stupid? How could you be so blasphemy to say that it was anything but flat? So it was violently opposed. And then all of a sudden, when science catches up, we see that that's just the way it is, and now it is self-evident. Well, basically all truth does pass through those stages. Whenever we're presented with something that doesn't fit our belief of truth, we ridicule it, we oppose it, and it takes generations for it to be accepted. So how come we have this confused idea about DNA? Well, let's go back through history a little bit. And this trend of science that we're talking about really started around 1670 with Isaac Newton. And he discovered, or he wrote, or he found the equations, the physical equations that describe planetary motions and inertia and movement. And all of a sudden, things went from being completely random and superstitious to having a set formulas and principles to describe them. And now, all of a sudden, the planets, the motions and gravity and attraction, all of those things could be explained. And everybody got so excited, they say, this is wonderful, we can explain the universe, finally. We can understand it and explain it and predict it. And then they did a leap of faith and they said, well, if the planets, if the universe, if apples and all these things are predictable, I bet everything is. Everything made of matter should be predictable. So they made this leap of faith and they defined the world as a huge, gigantic mechanical machine. That some parts are bigger, some parts are smaller, but it's all based on mechanical interaction. And that's the belief that they started then, and to this day that belief has not changed very much at all. It is still the founding principle for virtually all science that we have. If you can't touch it, it's not real. So between 1670 and 1953 is when they finally discovered the shape, the configuration of the DNA molecule. But that didn't really change the perception of matter. But between those years, the goal of science, and especially medical science, was to learn to manipulate the parts of the machine. And along with this idea came three principles. One's called materialism. That's the belief that matter, physical matter, is the most real thing there is. And anything else is really a byproduct. Reductionism, that means that the machine is only the sum of its parts. So if we have a huge machine, if we have a huge complicated arrangement, and if we just dissect it down to the minutest detail and we understand all the components, then we understand the whole. And determinism means that if we understand the whole, then we can start manipulating those tiny little particles and we can control all of creation. So this is what science has been working on for the last several hundred years. One of my favorite analogies about reductionism is, well, if you take something apart and try to understand the whole, that sort of becomes like taking a radio apart to find the music. And the problem is, the music isn't in the radio. It is a signal playing through the radio. And that's the crucial part that they're missing with this materialistic model. That they believe that all of the signals and everything, the electricity and the magnetism of the body, is an epiphenomenon. It's a secondary phenomenon of the physical body rather than the other way around. And we have more and more evidence today that we can pretty much prove that it's the other way around. Back to DNA, continued history. So, then around 1900, over 100 years ago, there were some really bright, cutting-edge physicists by the name of Einstein, Bohr, and Heisenberg. And they found a different kind of physics. They said that, you know, Newtonian physics explains a lot of this stuff, but there are huge gaps. It doesn't explain what happens at the very, very minute levels. So they defined and discovered something called quantum physics. And what they found is this was really the true physics, that this was, it didn't necessarily negate quantum physics, but it was a more complete form. It was a description at a higher level that superseded the mechanical physics. And what they found is the universe is not primarily a mechanical physical machine. It is primarily a field of information and signals. That is the highest level of reality of the entire universe is information and signals, and it is a field of energy. And Einstein even came up with a quote. He said, the field is the sole governing agent of the particle. Meaning when you're talking about physical matter consisting of particles, that the only thing that controls that is the energy of the field. Okay? That's pretty profound. But even though they discovered this, and even though computers and cell phones and radios and all of our electronics are based on quantum physics, our entire world would fall apart if we didn't understand and utilize quantum physics. For some reason, very little or virtually none of this way of thinking has made its way into what we call the scientific methodology, and especially in medical science. Then in 1953 they discovered the structure of DNA, and now they knew exactly what the DNA molecule looked like, but because they had the mindset of materialism, of the matter being the most real, as soon as they found the molecule and what it looked like, they said, hip hooray, eureka, we have found it, we need to look no further. Everything is explained. And they said, this DNA molecule is the thing that does it all. And they didn't really stop and ask, well, what is it that makes it do what it does? They just said, well, somehow it does it. And they just didn't question it any further because their mindset was so entrained in the materialistic philosophy. And then in 2003, they completed the Human Genome Project. They had listed and defined the structure of every single gene in the human genome, every DNA trait of the human. And we won't go into detail, but do some reading on that, because that was pretty interesting. They thought they would find 100,000 genes, and they found that we only had about 20,000. And all of a sudden it was very confusing, because now it didn't explain anything. It opened up Pandora's box of questions, because they said, well, we thought every gene would code for one protein, and now we know it doesn't. So it really didn't solve anything. But even with all of that, they still kept looking at the physical properties of the molecule. So if you go to the webpage for the Human Genome Project, they now have restated it a little bit. They say DNA is a blueprint, and they say that it does code for proteins, but they say the control mechanism is not in the DNA. But even though that's sort of the cutting edge, and they admit that at the cutting edge, it still hasn't changed anything about how the mainstream of medical science views the properties of DNA. And there's still little or no focus beyond the physical. They're still looking for more molecules and more chemicals to interact and determine what the behavior is. So the mainstream view is still that DNA controls biology and diseases. So that's sort of where we stand today. And now we'll move on and talk about a little bit how another way of looking at this. And one of my favorite quotes is by Mark Twain: what gets us in trouble is not what we don't know, it's what we know for sure that just ain't so. So for 300 years, we have known that physical matter is the real thing. And then it turns out with quantum physics that the physical matter is not the real thing. The invisible field is the real thing. But we're just real slow to catch on. So on slide number 8, this is the current model of the DNA. And this is as it is presented in media, as it's practiced in medical research. DNA is the molecule that somehow it has the ability to make a copy of itself, and it has an ability to make a carbon copy called RNA. And RNA is just like a mirror image stamp of DNA. So DNA can split up, it can make an RNA copy, and the RNA goes out into the cell and combines with proteins, with amino acids, and forms proteins. So you can read up on all of that. That's not what we're questioning or trying to figure out here today. That's very well established. But DNA makes RNA, and RNA makes protein. And protein is the only substance in the body that can perform work, that can contract, and that basically is responsible for all the properties of hormones and enzymes and contraction and so forth. So therefore, they say, well, protein is responsible for behavior and protein is responsible for disease, and since DNA makes protein, DNA is responsible for behavior and disease. So they've created that link, but they never questioned whether that link was complete. And that's what we're going to try to figure out here. So on slide number 9, what is DNA? The first 3 points here is what everyone agrees on. There's absolutely no doubt what DNA is. It is a blueprint. What is a blueprint? A blueprint for a house. It contains instructions on how to build a house. A cookbook is sort of a blueprint for making meals. What does it contain? It contains information on how to put ingredients together to make a meal. And the same thing holds true with DNA. DNA is a blueprint. It contains information on how to do something, how to combine amino acids into proteins. That's what a blueprint is. More so, we know that DNA, nucleic acids, are very, very stable. It's a molecule that they have found fossils, they have found frozen mammoth, they have found dinosaur pieces with DNA intact. 50, 100,000 years later, the DNA is so stable that you can pull it out and you can use it to code for protein. That's why nature has chosen DNA, because it's so remarkably stable. And we know that this stable shape sort of makes up letters, that each little shape, they're different nucleic acids, and they each represent letters, so to speak. There's 4 letters, and with these letters you can write. It's just like a 4-letter alphabet. You can start writing code and instructions. So far, that's what DNA is, and everyone agrees on that. So in the creation process down below, what do you need for a creation? We need a blueprint, information on how to put something together, but we also need building blocks, and we need someone to read the blueprint and take the building blocks and put them together according to the blueprint. Then we have completed the creation process. So oftentimes you hear that someone says, well, the gene turned on. Is the gene turned on, or is the gene turned off? Can a blueprint be on or off? No. A blueprint is a blueprint. What matters is, do you read the blueprint or don't you read the blueprint? But it can't be on or off, because it just is. So that's a little problem with nomenclature, but it gives us the idea that the DNA molecule does something that it can't do. So let's do a few more examples here. If you are going to build a house, and you start with a blueprint for a house, what would be the next thing that you need for a house? Any ideas?
Materials.
Building materials, exactly. You need 2x4s, you need screws and nails and lumber and sheetrock and all those good things. And now you have the blueprint and you have a pile of bricks. Is that going to make a house? No. You need someone to do something. So who does that? Builder? Builder, exactly. A builder, a contractor, a buyer. All those people initiate the process, and then you have workers and contractors and laborers to put the pieces together. So that completes the creation process for a house. But the blueprint didn't build a house. It can't do that. Same thing with a meal. We want to end up with a meal. Where do we start? Start with a cookbook. And then we read the cookbook, we see what sort of ingredients we need. Those are the building blocks. And then we need a cook to put it all together to make a meal. Does anyone believe that the cookbook cooked the meal? Right? It's laughable. And yet, when it comes to biology, they discovered the DNA, and all of a sudden, hey, oh, the DNA is the creator. It's just a molecule. It's just a blueprint. Okay? So on the final line here, you want to make a human, you need DNA, you need building blocks, and then is the big question mark. What is it that tells the DNA how, when, and what gene and how to combine everything. Okay, that's what we're going to spend a little more time on here. But there's some sort of activity, there's some initiator that tells the DNA what to do. Then obviously the building blocks, that's proper food. And it's not food, it's not artificial food, it's not artificial sweeteners, artificial color, it's not processed food from Nabisco and Kraft. It's food from nature that has the building blocks that we need. So there's a little more to it. And the current mainstream view is a little incomplete. And we've said that DNA doesn't make decisions, so what does make decisions? We'll introduce a few more pieces here. We'll look at the cell membrane, the receptors, and regulatory proteins. What are those? So the cell, first of all, you look at slide 11 here, very simplistic view. It is basically a bag that has a cell membrane around it. It's like celluloid all the way, plastic wrap all the way around it, and then there's fluid, and then there's protein filaments all the way through to keep the plastic bag sturdy and keep its shape. Then in the middle is the nucleus, and that's a smaller plastic bag inside, and that contains all the chromosomes, and inside the chromosomes are the DNA. That's where all the genetic code is. So we'll take a small portion of the outside cell membrane and we'll blow it up, and we'll move to slide number 12. And the cell membrane is probably the most underrated structure in biology ever. Because while they say, well, generally DNA is considered to be the brain, the control center, the hub, the big deal, the membrane is actually where all the action is. The membrane is truly the brain of the body, of the cell. The membrane is a two-layered bilipid layer. It has an outside with fat, an inside with fat, and then there's an in-between with little tails on it. The reason it looks like this is that the fat rejects water. So when you have two layers rejecting water, that creates a separation. And because of that membrane, you create a difference between inside the cell and outside the cell. So now any function in the body has to do with what happens inside and outside the cells. Brain cells signal by allowing different ions inside and outside. Every function of the cell depends on what is inside and outside. And in a way, that's like making decisions. The membrane decides what stays outside and what comes inside. And making decisions, this membrane is really very much like a computer chip. A computer chip decides ones and zeros. The cell membrane decides inside and outside. And how does it do that? Well, if you look at all these strange little attachments, we're still on number 12. If you look at all these strange attachments, those are receptors. And receptors are kind of like antenna. They pick up signals. And we have receptors that pick up signals from hormones. They are receptors that connect to hormones. There are receptors that connect to thyroid hormone and to insulin and growth hormone and all those things. Then there are receptors that respond to electricity. And there are other receptors that respond to electromagnetic vibration. So they truly are like little antennas. And what does a receptor do? A receptor takes one kind of stimulus and converts it into another. So the way the brain gets its information is you have receptors that detect your environment and convert it into electricity that it sends up to the brain, so the brain can be aware of your environment. Well, on the cellular level, these little receptors takes all the information outside the cell and makes it and converts it into another signal that can travel inside the cell. Then that inside the cell, this signal can travel in to the chromosome, to the DNA, and if it's the specific kind of signal, it will tell the DNA what to do. So that is where the instructions to the DNA come from. But there's one more step we want to cover. So if I have my sleeve rolled down here, and let's say that I wrote the DNA code on my arm. I wrote the code, the genetic instructions, and then I covered it up so you couldn't see the code. And there would be no way for you to know which part of the code to read. And that's what regulatory proteins do. Regulatory proteins cover up the DNA. In the chromosome, there's about 50% protein in the chromosome. So the way that we determine which part of the DNA to replicate, which gene to express at any given time, is we send a specific signal that rolls up the sleeve, that uncovers a specific regulatory protein to expose a specific part of DNA, and now that DNA can get into action. So that's the sequence of events that leads to the expression of a gene. You have a signal from the environment, whether it's outside of us or a signal outside the cell. That signal, the cell membrane determines if it's an appropriate signal. That signal travels in and stimulates the regulatory protein. It opens up a sequence of DNA, and now that part of the DNA is read. Okay? So we'll get more into what the huge, gigantic significance of this is. But it's not the DNA that does anything. I hope we've clarified that part. So now, number 14, we have a slightly revised model of how DNA works. It's not that the traditional model was wrong, it was just incomplete. Nobody asked, well, who tells DNA what to do? So now we see that it's the environment, the signals or the stress that triggers the DNA to get into action. And then the DNA makes RNA and protein and so forth. But the DNA is just a passive part of this larger picture. But now that we introduce the environment, now we need to understand a little bit more about how the environment works. What is the environment, and what is something called perception? So the brain gets all its information via receptors. The cell gets all its information via receptors. And receptors are something that translate the environment, the sight, the sound, the touch, the temperature, taste, smell, touch, all of those senses. It converts those into electrical signals. And so in a sense, the receptor, whether it's on the skin or on the surface of the cell, it's a unit of perception. That's what it is. It's the smallest unit of perception. And the sum total of your perception as a human is the sum total of all your receptors. Because they all send little messages in to the decision makers, the cell membrane and the brain cells, and they take this big picture and create your perception. Now, we have to understand, this is where it gets really exciting, because perception is not typically what we think it is. They've done experiments, and they take cats, they take newborn kitties, and if you don't know this, kitties are blind at birth. So sight is not something that they're born with. It's a sense that has to be entrained. So they take these little kitties and they put one group of kitties in an environment with all vertical stripes. And they take another group, and put them in an environment with all horizontal stripes. And then they have them live there for 2 weeks, and then they take them out. And 2 weeks is how long it takes for a cat, or a few weeks, I don't remember the number. how long it takes to develop the synapses, the brain cell connections, to develop the pattern of perception. So this is a learned behavior. Now, the kitties that were raised in horizontal with vertical lines, they cannot see anything horizontal. If you put a bar, they'll run straight into it. They have no ability to see it. And vice versa, the kitties that were raised with horizontal bars, stripes, they cannot see chair legs. They cannot see table legs. They run straight into them because they haven't developed the neuronal connections, the receptor apparatus, the synapses. They're just not there. And it gets better. When they train elephants in India, they take the little baby elephant that's just a tiny little thing. It's walking around unsteady. It's big for a baby, but it's not huge or very strong. They tie it with a regular rope around the leg. And this rope for a baby elephant is strong enough that it can't escape. So it makes the neuronal connections. It creates a belief system, a knowing that a rope is something you can't escape from. So they tie up the elephant every night with a little rope. Then over time, the elephant grows big and large, and they put it to work. And now you can tie a big chain around the leg of the elephant, and you can tie it to a tree, and the elephant will walk off with the tree. And then at night, you tie it back up with a flimsy little rope, and it can't escape. And this is a knowing. It's a belief system that is part of the neuronal connections that is so strong they cannot escape it. And what we have to understand is our perception is developed the same way. The way that we start believing things is that we learn how to believe. We learn what to believe in. All right? Third example, this is the best one. They took some mice and they had them smell camphor. Camphor is a strong smelling substance. And camphor is not supposed to have any effect on mice, so it didn't. It had no effect. Hours and hours, it had no effect. Then what they did is they had them smell camphor, and they gave them a little shot of something called poly-IC. And this is something that normally stimulates the immune system. So they did this a few times. They had them smell camphor, they gave them a shot, and their amount of killer T cells went up. That's the #1 defense against cancer. So they did that a few times, and then they just had them smell camphor, and what do you know? Their T cell count went up without the shot of poly-IC, because they had taught the nervous system of the mice to expect a boost of immune system. They had expected the shot, and the shot wasn't necessary. It was enough with the smell of camphor. Okay? It's a classic Pavlovian conditioning. Okay? But it's important to understand that it's not, the purpose of conditioning is not to get some dog to salivate. The purpose is that the conditioning is how the nervous system works. And then they had another group of mice. They did this parallel. And did the same thing. They had them smell camphor. There was no effect. Then they had them smell camphor, and they followed up with a neurotoxin that destroyed the immune system. And they did that a few times. Then they had them smell camphor alone without the neurotoxin, and same thing happened. They destroyed the immune system. So now you have two groups of mice, and they're going about their merry ways, and you have one of them smell camphor, and you have the other one smell camphor. And in one group of mice, there's a belief system that camphor increases your immune system. And the other group has the belief system at the cellular level that camphor destroys your immune system. And that's exactly what happens, because it's been conditioned, it's been ingrained in their cellular belief through connections and synapses and receptors. And then you take both of these groups of mice, you expose them to the smell of camphor, and you give them a carcinogen. So now, one group of mice will boost their immune system and survive the carcinogen and act as nothing happened. And the other group, they'll ruin their immune system and they'll die of cancer. They develop cancer and die. So one group is perfectly healthy, the other group dies of cancer. What's the difference? They have a difference in how they interpret the smell of camphor. The difference between life and death is what they believe a smell means. And this is how profound this receptor and conditioning business is. If we understand it, we can use it to benefit, or if we don't, it can destroy us. So a few conclusions here on perception, that the vast majority of perception is learned. Beliefs are nothing more than habituated patterns of perception. Beliefs are nothing more than thoughts we keep repeating. It is nothing more than things that we have seen over and over until they become an expectation. The immune systems in the mice happened via DNA, because it was the DNA that made the killer T cells. Okay, so when we're talking about DNA, we need to understand where in the chain this takes place. The DNA of the mice didn't change, but the expression changed. It was the DNA that they had was expressed differently to either make more T cells or less T cells. And again, the stimulus, the trigger, was a belief system that was conditioned. We've said this already, the difference between health and disease and even life and death is a perception. One of my favorite quotes by Shakespeare, "For there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." So all the things that we perceive that affect the body, that has a stressful or not so stressful effect on the body, are perceptions. And it's what we think about them that determine their meaning. So now we can move to a virtually completed model of DNA, where we see that at the top of the chain is the perception of the environment. That is the ultimate determinant of the expressed DNA. So it doesn't matter what DNA you have as much as it matters how it is expressed. And how it is expressed depends on your perception, your belief system. Okay? If you believe something is good or you believe something is bad. Next is my favorite cartoonist, Glass Bergen. He's got this psychoanalyst, and he's confessing or getting therapy. He said, "I was happy once, but then my cells started to divide and I acquired a heartbeat." So obviously he's talking about the moment of conception. That before that you're happy and then it goes downhill. And it's sort of funny, but it's not so far off the mark, unfortunately. Can DNA cause disease? Well, there are genetic diseases, so yes, it can. But it's not the kind of diseases that we're concerned with, that we talk about, because everything that kills people, the diabetes and the arthritis and the cancer and all those things, they are not genetic diseases. The genetic diseases are things like, they're less than 5% of the population has any genetic defect. And those are things like Down syndrome, Huntington's disease, Huntington's chorea, Tay-Sachs, it's a metabolic disease, sickle cell anemia, the cells don't form properly, so you can get blood clots, and Klinefelter syndrome, it's a sexual formation abnormality. What signifies a genetic disease is that if you have the genetic abnormality, you will always get the disease. 1,000,000 times out of 1,000,000. Not 7%, not 3%, not most of the time. Always. because it's a genetic disease. There's no other way to express that gene. It just doesn't know how to do it. That's a genetic disease. The other thing that they have in common goes back to the cartoon. I was happy once, but then my cells started to divide. Most genetic diseases happen before the cells start to divide. It's at the moment of conception, the problem is already there. Those are genetic diseases. Everything else that they talk about with cancer and heart disease and diabetes, those are not genetic diseases. So what are they? Well, we said this, if a gene caused cancer, then everyone with that gene would get the cancer. Not 7%, not 3 out of 5, everyone. So the way it really works is your DNA, there are different qualities of DNA. Some people are a little bit luckier than others. So some people can get away with more stuff than others. They have a stronger defense. So what your genetic code can do for you is, if you're lucky, they can get you a little bit more resistance to disease. But that said, it doesn't mean that you have to express the gene. If you have it, you still don't have to express it. This brings me back to my favorite gene, the hangover gene. Mm-hmm. You see, even if you have a hangover gene, or even if you have two, you still have to drink alcohol to get a hangover. Okay, it doesn't matter if you have the gene, you have to do something to trigger it. And that's the environment, and that's the perception. Okay? So, does DNA matter? Yes. Does it matter very much? Not nearly as much as we believe it does. And I'll finish up with another perspective on that too. So what about family history? Well, everything on the previous slide applies. But what we have to realize with family history is families have a lot in common. And having a gene doesn't mean that you have to express it, like we said. It's about lifestyle. So what families have in common are they have genes. Quite a few genes are similar for family members. But what you also get from your family is you learn how to think. That's a perception. You learn how to eat. You learn what to believe. You learn how to react. And you learn how to stress. Okay? And those are the determinants of which genes you express. So does DNA matter? Yes. Does perception matter? Yes. Probably much, much more so. And now we get back to the classic, we're going to wrap this up. We get back to the classic dilemma of nature versus nurture. Which one is more important? They've always had this argument, does it matter more who your parents are, or does it matter more which environment you grow up in? And both matter. But here's my take on this. They're both right to a point, but what really matters more is what do you choose to believe about it? Because here's what it says. If you believe in the classic model of DNA, that DNA is responsible for behavior and disease, then you are believing that your fate was sealed at the moment of conception. That in that moment, everything about you was determined and you have very little say in it. So don't worry, just go about your business and wait for the disease. Wait for whatever is supposed to happen to you. And the second part that it says is, because your disease is predetermined and you can't do anything about it, the only ones that can do something about it are these really clever medical doctors who can invent a magic bullet for you. So if you buy in, and that's what we've done as a society, we've bought into that model. They tell us, you have nothing to do with it. It's all in your genes. Your fate was determined. Your diseases are predetermined. Look at your family history. It's all in there. And don't worry about it. Just pay your insurance premiums and we'll take care of it. we'll find a magic bullet. And if you're unlucky, then you'll perish before we find a cure. And if you're lucky, then we'll find a cure for you, but that's your only hope. That's what the model says. However, if you buy into a little bit more the environment model, the perception model, now you can stop being a victim. You become the creator. Because now it doesn't really matter which model is right, but it gives you some control. It allows you to choose your thoughts. It allows you to choose your environment, and with that, you choose how you express your DNA. So it doesn't matter if you live in a family that has a 99% risk of cancer. You decide if you're the 1%, and you do something about it. So that pretty much concludes what we have to say about DNA and heredity. I thank you for coming. Very much enjoyed this topic. This, as you can tell, it's one of my favorites. And please feel free to come back for the rest of our series. Again, look at the other videos on YouTube. And if you feel that you got something out of this, please tell somebody so that they can learn something, so that they don't have to buy into the victim model, so they don't have to get on drugs and do things that will destroy their lives. So, thank you very much.